What appealed to me about this particular subject was, one, its exotic locale. It, frankly, it brought back memories of Alibaba and the 40 Thieves and Jason and the Argonauts, just that whole exotic Middle Eastern type feel. And I just thought it was so interesting. And on top of that, I liked the complexity of the scene. I really liked all of the different wares that were on display for customers who might would be coming by, and so that's what appealed to me about this particular subject. Now it's painted on arches paper, and you may be looking and going, "Is that a watercolor painting brush?" I don't think so. I think it's more of an acrylic type brush, at least from the start. And I use a lot of different brushes when I'm watercolor painting. I don't always use just conventional watercolor brushes. As many of you know who follow my videos, you'll know that I really like using Chinese calligraphy brushes. I really like them quite a bit. So I definitely will use just whatever's available, whatever I think I might like. And I will say that even though I said this is watercolor, and it is, there's also a tremendous amount of casein being involved as well. And casein has a great deal more body to it, so you can either tone it down or thin it down rather using a lot of water and use it as a traditional watercolor medium, or you can go in and just scoop up a whole lot of paint and use it as if you were oils or full-bodied acrylics. So the more I'm watching this, the more I'm thinking, this might actually be mostly casein. And I'll have to apologize. I'm a working illustrator and portrait painter, and so I work quite a bit, and I will very often record what I'm painting. And if I'm working on a magazine series for a magazine, I might do 6 or 8 paintings, just one after the other. And frankly, when I come back to do these voiceovers, I'm as much surprised as you are. I don't always remember what's going on, so I don't necessarily know what brush I was using or what paint I was using. So sometimes I have to figure it out as I go along. Now, with this, I didn't do any preliminary drawing. I just started out with using the big shapes that made up the architecture, and then began breaking it down from there. And I really wanted to do it this way because when you're doing figures, when you're doing animals, anytime you're doing more simplistic silhouette type shapes, then it is easier in some ways to simply block in one big silhouette and then break it down into its either its constituent parts or just building off of it, trying to make it just a little more complex. That's a little more straightforward. If you do get a subject like a cityscape where there are a lot of buildings, traffic, people, it can be more challenging, but it can also be a whole lot easier to paint a big scene like that because you don't get all caught up in trying to draw everything and then try to kind of color your drawing in. So I really like when I'm afforded the opportunity to do a complex scene like this, and I just start with the big shapes and work my way in, and I don't have any drawing. I'm using mostly flat brushes, at least here at the beginning, and the reason I like large flats or brights sometimes is that they're really very versatile. You can use it flat wise and make broad strokes, but then you can turn it on its side, and depending on how good the brush is, if it's relatively new and well taken care of, you can get just this sharp chisel that will give you very straight lines, very thin, narrow lines, and then you can even tilt it over on its at a diagonal and use just the tip of one corner, and very often get some very tight areas. So I like that about that particular family of brushes, the flats and the brights. And I will say they vary. I always swore I'd never use brights because they were so short and stubby that I just didn't see any use for them. But over time, I discovered that different manufacturers make brushes differently. So a bright in one from one manufacturer may actually be as long and flexible as a flat from another. So I always say never because you don't know what might present itself down the road. And of course, the trick to this type of painting, and actually all painting, is regardless of how you approach the subject, is to always look at the biggest shapes you can and work from there. And not only look for the biggest shapes of physical objects, but also look for the biggest shapes in your shadows, your shadow shapes. And more often than not, ignore physical shapes entirely and look at shadow patterns and shadow shapes if they're there, because you can take buildings, people, a street, cars, and if they're all lumped into one shadow, then you can paint that one big shadow. And then if that shadow shape is right, that really helps you to pre-visualize the smaller shapes within the shadow, and then begin to break it down. And it may, it's like eating what is the sort of saying? How do you eat an entire cow? One bite at a time. That kind of thing. When you see a really complex subject that just overwhelms you, coming in and approaching it where you're looking at the fewest shapes possible, that makes it so much easier to consume. You can look and wrap your head around this one really big shape, then come in later and say, okay, well, within that one big shape, I see 2 or 3 smaller shapes. So you define them. Then within each of those 2 or 3 smaller shapes, you see still further smaller shapes. And you don't get distracted, you don't get overwhelmed by hundreds, maybe thousands of shapes. And you can slowly but surely build up to as complex a subject matter as you want. Now, for the most part, always remember that less is more. The less that you say, usually the more that you say. Or the less that you articulate, the more you say. So that's a good way of thinking about it, is sort of like in a conversation, trying to put forth your ideas with as fewer words as possible and not overwhelm everyone around you with just massive amounts of verbiage. Now, I did say that I am using casein, and I like casein a great deal. It does shift in its color values as it goes from a wet state to a dry state. All paints do that, some to a greater degree than others, but casein shifts its color and value fairly moderately so that you're not distracted with putting something in. You come back 5 minutes later, it's dry and it's 3 shades darker or 3 shades lighter, and you feel like, well, you've got to go in and restate it because it's not what you wanted. I like that. I like that you can put it down, and within reason, it will be fairly close to the end product. Will be fairly close to what you put down originally. Casein, for those who don't know, is a milk-based product, and it's pretty acidic, so it's real rough on brushes. You cannot use natural hair brushes on with casein. If you do, it'll deteriorate. It'll eat the brushes up. So you don't want to use your good Kolinsky sables or anything like that with casein. You definitely want to use nylon brushes. And of course, for me, I clean my brushes with soap and water always at the end of every painting session. I don't care what medium I paint with. Really, even watercolors, I'll usually clean my brushes. Sometimes not, but even that, I really like to. I like to start with a clean brush. You're less likely to have any buildup in the ferrule, which will cause your bristles to flare out and cause you to lose the shape of the brush, especially the point if you've got a round. And so it's just nice. It's a good way of winding down, because I know for me at the end of the day, I've been painting for a long time, to just stop, go in very gently. I'm very gentle with it. To go in, get some liquid soap, and stand there at the sink and wash out my brushes. It's just sort of a ritualistic way of winding down the day. And then the next day, it's almost like you're starting with a brand new brush because they're so nice and supple and everything. Now, hopefully you'll see as I've been working through that I'm just breaking down, putting in shapes that suggest, I don't know what all that stuff was, bottles and pans and rugs and all sorts of jugs and just whatever. And it really doesn't matter to a large extent if you describe. If you go into a painting and you're working on a particular subject and it's just got lots of something like dishes, pots, pans, things like that, you don't have to go in and describe each and every one of them very meticulously. Actually, if you paint just a few that look like whatever you're doing, say pots and pans, you do just a few that take on that shape, then you can go in and with very minimal suggestion, you can suggest with a few brush strokes that you've painted dozens or hundreds. And it's sort of like painting leaves. You can paint, scrub in with a brush, and then paint just a couple of leaves very carefully. And people come in and go, oh my gosh, you must have spent days just with a tiny brush painting one leaf at a time. And of course, you didn't. The same thing with the pots and pans. It'll take on that look as if you painted meticulously 40 pots and pans, when in reality you only painted a couple very carefully, and then you used suggestion to bring out the rest. Now, that is not a license to be sloppy or haphazard. I'm not suggesting you go in and just slap the brush around carelessly and then try and draw one or two meticulously. That's not going to work. It'll look exactly like that. But all I'm suggesting is that you don't have to go in and meticulously beat yourself to death with drawing each and every object. Plus, people like puzzles. They like mysteries. That's why puzzles sell, and that's why mysteries are very popular in books and in movies, is because people like to see things that they themselves can solve. And well, how much fun would a Sherlock Holmes mystery be is if you knew who done it from the very beginning? Well, it wouldn't be very interesting. How interesting would a crossword puzzle be if you open up the paper and it's sitting there with all the answers filled in? Well, not very interesting. By the same token, a painting where everything is very meticulously spelled out and there's nothing for you to do, the viewer may look and go, wow, that person's really good. They've got this amazing technique. They can make it look like a photograph. But that doesn't last very long. They look and go, oh, okay, well, wow, that's pretty amazing. But then it's bored now, and they'll move on to something else. Whereas a painting that may in fact not be painted as well, the artist may not have as many skills. But what they've done is painted something that's interesting to look at, that makes the viewer stop and go, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? This is an interesting storyline. So that's just an encouragement to let your viewer work with you on this painting, and don't try to spell everything out for them. All right, well, I think I'll wrap this up. I'll put a little bit of music on and let you finish out the painting. If you've enjoyed this episode of The Arthropologist, please hit the like button. And if you'd like to see more episodes like this, think about subscribing. I'm Bill Wilson, and I'm The Arthropologist.